want to put a reward up for $50,000 for anybody that could give the information that will lead to an arrest and a conviction in the case of what happened.
He had a way of making people feel seen, welcomed, and valued. He could lift your confidence with just a few words and make you feel like you belong. That's Christine Wansley, standing over her son's casket, describing the 18-year-old the world only came to know after he stopped coming home. 14 days after Nolan Wells disappeared on a 4th of July boat trip with friends, his mother had to find the words to describe him in the past tense, in front of a church that could not hold everyone who came, in front of a country that had never met him while he was alive. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what's been confirmed about this case: the funeral, the reward, the competing autopsies, the phone that ended up in someone else's hands. And we're going to be precise about it, because this family has already had enough of their son's story shaped by speculation. What follows is what's actually on the record, said by name, by direct quote, by people who were actually there. No guesswork, no theories dressed up as fact, just what has genuinely been confirmed, and an honest account of what still hasn't been. If this is your first time with us, welcome to Behind the Crime Tape, where we follow real, unresolved cases with care and precision. If that's what you're here for, hit like, subscribe to Behind the Crime Tape, and turn on notifications, because this is a story that deserves to be followed all the way through, not just for one news cycle. Let's start with who Nolan Wells actually was, because it's far too easy for a case this complicated to bury the person underneath the headlines. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a graduate of Ocean Springs High School, and a rising sophomore wide receiver on Southwest Mississippi Community College's football team, an athlete by his family's account with real NFL ambitions. Attorney Ben Crump has said Nolan was a good swimmer, a detail that matters because it complicates the earliest, simplest explanation offered for his death.
Determined pending investigation, and we'll explain that as we go through the report this morning. The manner of death, undetermined pending investigation. Statement of examination: this forensic pathologist was retained to perform a second autopsy examination on the body of Nolan Xavier Wells. Name of deceased, date of death unknown. So therefore, again, the manner and cause of death is undetermined until further investigation. We are hopeful that the Mississippi Medical Examiner would give Dr. Mitchell an opportunity to see their photographs and their observations to the condition of Nolan Wells' body closer in time to July 4th. That is very important, and we have to continue to demand transparency, President Johnson. He said, definitive circumstances of death are required to determine the manner of death. For these reasons, this pathologist cannot rule out, and let me really call your attention to this. For these reasons, this pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Understand, he's saying based on the examination of the body, he cannot rule out foul play. That is significant.
On July 4th, 2026, he traveled by boat with a group of friends from high school, all of them white, to Horn Island, a popular 4th of July destination off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, a narrow strip of sand and scrub brush accessible only by boat, and packed that day with people. There were so many people. I mean boats, they were practically on top of each other. It was intense. One friend who was there, Lucas Aviz, later told Inside Edition, Nolan never made it home. His body was recovered 2 days later, on July 6th, in the waters off the island's northwestern tip. Here's where the trouble with this case actually begins, and it begins almost immediately. Authorities with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department and other agencies were quick to say publicly that they did not suspect foul play, a statement made before toxicology work had even been completed, before the full autopsy process had concluded, before the kind of laboratory analysis that takes real weeks to complete had been given the time it needed. For a family absorbing the worst news of their lives, that early characterization didn't sound like an investigation still unfolding. It sounded like a conclusion arriving before the evidence that should have supported it. It's worth understanding why that gap matters so much, and why investigators and prosecutors are trained in nearly every serious death investigation to avoid exactly this kind of early public characterization. The entire discipline of death investigation rests on a simple principle: don't rule anything out before the evidence itself rules it out for you. That's not bureaucratic caution for its own sake. It's the only way to make sure that a genuinely uncertain case doesn't get quietly closed in the public's mind before the actual forensic work has had the chance to catch up. When an early statement gets ahead of that evidence, even with good intentions, even without any deliberate attempt to mislead anyone, it creates exactly the kind of distrust that has now shaped this entire case from its earliest days forward. That gap between what officials said and what the science had actually established is the reason Nolan's parents made a decision most grieving families never have to consider. Rather than rely solely on the state's own examination, they arranged, through attorney Ben Crump, to have Nolan's body sent out of state entirely to an independent examiner with no connection to Mississippi law enforcement. That examiner was Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., and president of the National Medical Association. One of the most credentialed independent pathologists a family in this position could have retained.
It's consistent with what they're telling you. No, it's not consistent telling you. We don't give full reports until that first autopsy report comes because there's some limitations with a second autopsy, as you can imagine. Right. Yeah. So we're very transparent, very objective. And the majority of cases that I've done at Know Your Rights are what they said, right? Are what initially they thought it was going to be. And there's some that haven't been. My mom got a diagnosis not too long ago of multiple myeloma. She got a diagnosis of multiple myeloma, and she said, I got a diagnosis, I trust my oncologist, I trust my primary care provider, but Roger, I want a second opinion. Mm-hmm. They went to the second opinion, we did all the tests, turned out it wasn't multiple myeloma, right? It was an inflammation that resolved itself.
Wow.
You see what I'm saying?
That's a really
that's a big deal.
My grandmother passed away from that.
Do you understand? Yeah. That's a serious diagnosis. We thought that this is what we were going to be dealing with. At second opinion, it wasn't. So imagine if you're a family member and they said that your loved one died from sickle cell trait. Right? There was a big news story in the New York Times that won a Pulitzer that I was quoted in that talked about sickle cell trait causing sudden death. Imagine your family says your loved one died from sickle cell trait. And you're like, what? They died from sickle cell trait. They're in prison, they're in jail. And then that loved one goes to and gets a second examination, and there's bruises and fractures and a bleed in the head and grip marks all over them. It's not sickle cell trait that they died from. Right. They died from that altercation with law enforcement. Right.
Sit with that decision for a moment, because it's not a small one. This is a family already broken open by loss in the exact days they should have been allowed to simply grieve, choosing instead to delay saying goodbye a little longer, choosing to send their son's body across state lines, choosing to trust a stranger in another city more than the process unfolding in their own backyard. That's not a decision made out of anger. It's a decision made out of necessity by people who had already learned, the hardest way possible, that the first answer isn't always the whole answer. What that independent autopsy actually found, and what it couldn't find, deserves to be described exactly as it was written, not exaggerated past what the report itself supports. Dr. Mitchell's examination could not determine Nolan's cause or manner of death. Cause and manner, undetermined, pending further investigation. According to Mitchell's own report, a major limitation was his inability to directly observe Nolan's airway and lungs for water, or his stomach for its contents, because the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office had already removed those organs during its own autopsy days earlier. Mitchell was careful to note that this kind of retention during an initial autopsy is common forensic pathology practice, not evidence of concealment. But it meant that even a second, highly credentialed examination inherited real limitations it couldn't overcome. Mitchell also documented red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, with the cause listed as unclear Not confirmed as an injury, not ruled out as one either. That's now 2 separate medical examinations of the same 18-year-old, and neither one has produced a completed, publicly released finding. The state's own autopsy, performed July 7th, still hasn't been released either, and District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has confirmed that the results of the full investigation will be presented to a grand jury once it concludes, meaning the state's findings likely won't become public before that grand jury review happens.
As District Attorney for the 19th Circuit Court District of Mississippi, I want to talk directly to the people of Jackson County. Our community is grieving the tremendous loss of Nolan Wells, who is loved and treasured by everyone. Nolan's family deserves answers, and our community deserves answers. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, are presented to your grand jury. Many people don't know that. We have handled death investigations in this manner my entire career. Nolan's case is being handled the same way, with the same care and the same commitment to the truth that we handle all death investigations. I understand the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but we are not taking time for time's sake. We are taking the time required to complete the work this investigation demands. Since Nolan was reported missing, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies have worked around the clock investigating what happened to him. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every credible lead must be followed to its conclusion. Every witness interview must be analyzed in context of all other evidence. The pressure for answers does not change what the work requires. Our responsibility to Nolan and our community is to complete this investigation thoroughly, carefully, without compromise, supported by the evidence and worthy of the confidence of the people we serve. I also understand that many people have questions about why more information has not been released publicly. In Mississippi, the rules of professional conduct restrict the information a prosecutor can release during an investigation. Our restraint in communicating facts and evidence is not an effort to keep the truth from the public. It is an effort to protect the integrity of this investigation and the grand jury proceeding. As your district attorney, I have an ethical obligation to avoid public statements that could influence witnesses, prejudice a proceeding, or compromise the fairness of the legal process. My obligation extends to and requires me to use reasonable care to ensure investigating agencies avoid making those statements and releasing information as well. These rules exist to protect the search for the truth, not to prevent it. As divided as the discussion surrounding Nolan's death has become, I know we all want the same thing, to understand what happened to Nolan. With that being our shared goal, we must also share in the goal of protecting the integrity of how the truth is discovered. If we sacrifice the integrity of the process in effort to satisfy today's questions, we risk undermining the confidence in tomorrow's answers. When the public asks, what about this, or have they looked at that, or did they think about this? The answer is yes. Those are the same questions investigators ask. The difference is that we can't publicly discuss the evidence, the interviews, or what those efforts have uncovered while the investigation is underway. Again, our restraint in sharing details of the investigation is not a refusal to share the truth. It is our commitment to protect the process that allows the truth to be known with confidence. There's a lot of information out there, and there is a heck of a lot of misinformation out there. I simply want the community I serve to know that this investigation is being handled with the care, professionalism, and commitment to the truth that every family in Jackson County deserves. As we continue this important work, Nolan's family, his friends, and all who loved him remain in our prayers.
Now let's talk about the phone, because it's one of the central, unresolved details in this entire case, and it's worth understanding exactly why it matters as much as it does. When investigators began reconstructing Nolan's final hours, one detail never sat right with the people closest to this case: his phone, the device most likely to hold his last messages, his last calls, the clearest possible record of what he said and to whom, in the hours before his friends left the island without him, did not stay with him. It ended up in the possession of the friends who returned. Crump has raised this publicly and directly, arguing that if investigators are willing to examine Nolan's phone, every phone present on that trip deserves the same scrutiny, not one device treated differently from the rest. That request has been communicated to the district attorney's office. As of the most recent reporting, there's no public confirmation of whether that examination has actually been completed for every device involved.
And we don't understand how we're getting so much hate behind it. We all cared and loved Nolan, and nobody wanted to see Nolan die. Nobody wanted to see his life be taken so short.
There's a real human cruelty in that specific kind of waiting, not simply grieving an absence you can't yet explain, but suspecting that somewhere in a phone, a file, an evidence room, the explanation may already exist and simply hasn't been shared yet. Let's also address, directly and carefully, the central contradiction that's followed this case since its earliest days, because it's genuinely the piece that makes this story so difficult to resolve. According to the 3 friends who traveled with Nolan to the island, he told them, before they left, that he wanted to stay behind with a young woman he'd been talking to that day. According to that same young woman, later identified publicly as Katie McCormack, she believed the opposite, that Nolan told her he intended to get back on the boat with his friends. Crump has also said that videos circulating online allegedly show Nolan in a heated argument with people around him that day, a claim that 2 of Nolan's own friends have since disputed publicly, saying the person in at least one widely circulated video wasn't Nolan at all, and that the audio itself had been recorded from too far away to clearly capture what was actually being said. 2 accounts, 2 different versions of the same handful of minutes, and somewhere in the space between them sits a question nobody, not the family, not investigators, not the public, has been able to answer yet. What actually happened to Nolan Wells after those final words were exchanged on that beach? Now to July 20th, the day this family had to bury their son. Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs filled well past capacity. Cars lined the streets for blocks. People who had never met Nolan Wells stood outside because there was no room left inside, waiting simply to be near a moment that had already reached far beyond one stretch of Mississippi coastline. The funeral opened with tearful remarks from Nolan's parents, describing their son as a warm and gentle presence, a role model to his younger siblings, and a gifted athlete with real NFL ambitions. Christine Wansley's words, delivered in front of that packed church, are worth hearing again in full. He had a way of making people feel seen, welcomed, and valued. He could lift your confidence with just a few words and make you feel like you belong. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, and it was not by any account a quiet one. Sharpton invoked Mississippi's own difficult history directly from the pulpit, naming Emmett Till and Medgar Evers in the same breath as Nolan Wells.
That one day he wanted to have 3 daughters that he would name Sophia, Charlotte, and Olivia. He had a deep love for the Lord and an unwavering faith that was evident in the way he lived his life. Lastly, I ask that each of you keep Nolan's memory alive. Hold him close in your hearts. Share his stories and never stop saying his name. As long as we continue to remember him, his light will continue to shine through us all. Nolan, we love you. We'll continue to fight for you. Yes. And until we meet again, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.
The reason why a lot of people in the nation are looking at this Nolan situation is that we've looked at history in Mississippi, Sharpton said. Some of us remember what happened in Mississippi. He continued, before we can medicate and heal today, we've got to look at your history. That's not a comparison this family necessarily asked for by name. But by the time Sharpton finished speaking it, it had become part of how this case would be remembered going forward, inseparable from the broader, painful context of a state whose history with cases exactly like this one has never been fully resolved. In the middle of that eulogy, Sharpton did something a funeral rarely includes. He turned from grief to a direct call to action. He announced a $100,000 reward for anyone with information leading to an arrest in Nolan's case, with half of that sum covered by filmmaker Tyler Perry, who had also quietly paid for the funeral itself without seeking attention for it. In the time since, that reward has grown further to $125,000, with additional contributions joining Sharpton's and Perry's original pledge. "Let every stone be rolled back and every veil be torn asunder," Sharpton said, "and let truth pop out of the ground like a flower."
Celebrate Nolan, and at the same time say we want a full and thorough investigation. I want to put a reward up for $50,000 for anybody that could give the information that will lead to an arrest and a conviction in the case of what happened. He was not on that island by himself. Somebody saw something and knows something.
The crowd that day included filmmaker Spike Lee, former NFL player Terrell Owens, and numerous prominent black clergy members, a room that had gathered to mourn a teenager and left by the end, demanding something closer to a mission. Near the close of the service, attorney Ben Crump led the congregation in a chant that began low near the front pews and rose row by row until it carried out through the open doors into the parking lot beyond them. Nolan's life mattered. Crump also gave voice to the question sitting at the center of this entire case, plainly, without embellishment. They went out on the boat came back, and Nolan washed up on the shore 2 days later dead. Wouldn't you want answers? That is, in the end, the whole case in one sentence. Not a theory, not an accusation aimed at any specific person. Just an unanswered question that a mother had to bury her son without ever getting to hear resolved. At the press conference that followed the funeral, Crump confirmed something concrete. His team and the district attorney's office had agreed to a joint inspection of Nolan's phone, with experts representing the family examining the device alongside law enforcement's own investigators, rather than each side working separately and comparing conclusions afterward. He also confirmed that the district attorney has agreed to present the full investigation's findings to a grand jury once the work is complete. When a reporter asked directly whether there was any update on the independent autopsy results, Crump's answer was honest and not the one anyone in that crowd wanted to hear. Not yet. The findings were still being finalized. No date, no promise beyond the family's commitment that when the results exist, they'll be shared. By the end of that press conference, one thing had become unmistakably clear. No suspect has been named, no homicide has been formally declared, and no answers have arrived. Only a family standing in front of microphones, hours after burying their son, still doing the work of pressing for information that should have reached them long before now, rather than the other way around. It's worth addressing, honestly and carefully, why this case has reached the scale of national attention it has, because it's about more than any single detail of the investigation itself. Nolan Wells was the only black friend in the group that traveled to Horn Island that day, and the only one who didn't make it back. That fact, paired with an early public statement ruling out foul play before the science existed to support it, and a phone that ended up in someone else's hands entirely, moved from a background detail to the center of the national conversation, whether anyone intended it to or not. It's reopened conversations that have never fully closed in that part of the country, about who gets believed quickly and who has to fight to be believed at all, about how fast a case gets treated as settled when the right people aren't watching closely enough. We want to be precise about what that context is and isn't, because precision is exactly what a case like this one deserves. A photograph on its own proves nothing about what happened on that island. Outlets and officials covering this case have said exactly that, publicly, from the very start. But context matters, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. For a lot of people watching this case unfold from far outside Mississippi, it's landed somewhere deeply personal. Parents of black teenagers have spoken openly about looking at their own sons a little differently since this story broke, about an ordinary, previously unremarkable fact, a group trip, a boat, a weekend with friends, suddenly carrying a weight it never used to carry. That shift is quiet and largely invisible to anyone outside the community feeling it, but it's a real part of why this case hasn't faded the way so many others do. There's a reason Reverend Sharpton chose, specifically, to name Emmett Till and Medgar Evers in that eulogy, rather than simply speaking in general terms about grief and justice. Both names carry a very specific, very concrete history in Mississippi. Cases where the truth about what happened to a black victim took years, sometimes decades, to be fully acknowledged, if it ever fully was. Invoking them wasn't rhetorical flourish for its own sake. It was Sharpton placing Nolan's case explicitly inside a lineage of Mississippi cases where the public was told one story early, and where the fuller, more complicated truth took far longer to surface than it should have. Whether Nolan's case ultimately follows that same pattern is something nobody can answer yet. But understanding why that comparison was made and why it landed the way it did in that room is part of understanding why this specific case has traveled as far as it has. And still, running underneath all of that, there's been genuine restraint from the people actually covering this case closely. Nobody responsibly reporting on this story has claimed to know exactly what happened on that island, not the journalists who followed it week to week, and not even Nolan's own family's attorney, standing in front of cameras answering questions. What's been said consistently is that too many basic answerable questions remain open. A timeline that doesn't fully add up, results that haven't been released, a phone whose full examination status remains unconfirmed. That's the tension sitting at the center of this case right now. A public that has already formed a feeling shaped by a photograph, a delay, and a statement made too soon, set against an investigation that has not yet produced a finding anyone can point to and call final. So where does this case actually stand tonight? 2 separate autopsies remain unfinished. The state's and the family's independent examination, neither one publicly released. The question of whether every phone connected to that day, not just Nolan's, has received equal scrutiny remains unconfirmed. The contradiction between what Nolan's friends say he told them and what Katie McCormack says he told her remains exactly as unresolved as it was the week this story broke. A reward now stands at $125,000 for information leading to an arrest. A public acknowledgement, made at Nolan's own funeral, that this case remains entirely unsolved. What we can say clearly without exaggerating a single detail past what's actually been confirmed is this. A family buried their 18-year-old son on July 20th without knowing how he died, walked directly from that funeral into a press conference because their grief has never once been allowed to stand alone, and continues, week after week, to press for answers that should have arrived long before now. There's a particular exhaustion in that, the exhaustion of grieving and investigating at the same time, of choosing a casket in the same week you're answering reporters' questions about an autopsy, of checking the news every morning for an update that keeps almost arriving and never quite does. Before we close, it's worth remembering exactly who this story belongs to. Nolan Wells made people feel seen and valued. That's not our description, it's his own mother's, spoken over his casket. He was building toward a future in football. He was, by his own attorney's account, a good swimmer, which makes the simplest explanation offered for his death sit uneasily with everyone who actually knew him. He went out on a boat with friends on an ordinary holiday weekend, the kind of afternoon that happens thousands of times across that same stretch of coastline every summer. Whatever the 2 pending autopsies, the grand jury process, and the ongoing investigation ultimately reveal, that loss is permanent, and it deserves to remain the actual center of this story, not a footnote to the online debate that's grown up around it. If this gave you a clearer, more complete understanding of where this case actually stands, share it with someone who's been following along, and let us know in the comments what part of this story stays with you most. The contradiction between the 2 accounts of that final afternoon, the still pending autopsies, or the reward that's grown to $125,000 because nobody yet has come forward with the whole truth. We'll be back the moment there's real, confirmed movement in this case, because this family has waited long enough for half answers, and they deserve nothing less than the complete truth, told carefully and told right. If you want to be here for every verified update as this case develops, make sure you hit like on this video, subscribe to Behind the Crime Tape, and turn on notifications. This has been Behind the Crime Tape.